I had a couple options on the table, all right? So I could have fought this case to the end of the world, spent probably upwards of $30,000.
In May 2025, Houston Cross posted a farewell video that most people watched and moved on from. But buried inside it was one sentence that didn't add up. "There's a lawsuit, an insurance problem, and a body shop situation," he said, "and they told me I can't talk about it." That's not something you expect from a polished business goodbye. That's the kind of thing you say when there's a story you're not allowed to tell. Royalty Exotic Cars had spent a decade as Las Vegas's most recognized exotic car rental brand, with the fleet, the following, and the revenue to match. So what actually happened? That's what this is. The rise nobody saw coming. Before any of the drama, the lawsuits, the crashes, the shutdown, there's one thing worth knowing about Royalty Exotic Cars. It genuinely should have collapsed in its first year. The fact that it didn't is actually the more interesting part of the story. Houston Cross launched Royalty Exotic Cars in 2015 in Las Vegas with a straightforward pitch: give regular people access to the kind of cars they'd normally only see in a magazine. Lamborghinis, Ferraris, McLarens, all available by the hour from a showroom on Dean Martin Drive. It was a concept that looked even better on a phone screen than it did on paper. Houston understood marketing. His YouTube channel became just as much a part of the brand as the cars themselves. He documented purchases, modifications, and the behind-the-scenes side of the business, and an audience showed up that converted directly into paying customers. By 2018, Royalty was reportedly generating over $500,000 in revenue every single month. A Forbes profile captured Houston at 29, living in a multi-million-dollar home with a garage full of hypercars, all of it funded by tourists willing to drop serious cash to spend a few hours in a Lamborghini. But there's something that Forbes' profile didn't make central to its story. The early years of Royalty weren't just exciting, they were brutal. Houston's original rental lineup included a Lamborghini Huracan, a Lamborghini Aventador, a Ferrari 458, and a McLaren 650S. Of those 4 cars, 2 were completely destroyed. The Aventador caught fire. So did the McLaren. Gone. The Ferrari 458 blew through 7 transmissions over the course of its rental life. 7. The only car that proved genuinely durable was the Huracan, which eventually logged 188,000 rental miles over 5 years before needing a gearbox replacement. That's an extraordinary amount of damage for a starting fleet of 4 cars. And it immediately tells you something real about what this business actually involved. Not the glamour version, but the daily, expensive, physically destructive reality of putting supercars in the hands of strangers and absorbing whatever happened next. Despite all of that, Houston didn't slow down. The fleet grew to over 30 supercars. The company expanded into a limousine service, merchandise, and a Las Vegas driving event called Royalty Rally. Operations spread across 5 buildings. The reviews coming in were strong. By early 2025, Royalty had accumulated nearly 2,000 TripAdvisor entries, with plenty of customers describing it as a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Houston also kept finding ways to keep the brand interesting. He publicly documented a project converting a Bugatti from all-wheel drive to rear-wheel drive, the kind of content that gets real attention in the car community and reinforced the perception that Royalty wasn't just another rental shop. It was a brand with a point of view. The problem with building a brand around aspirational experiences is that it requires constant execution. Customers come in with a specific expectation, and when anything falls short, a fee they didn't anticipate, a contract term they didn't clock, a car that didn't deliver the way they imagined, the reaction can be disproportionate. Exotic car rental is not a business with much margin for error, and the costs of keeping it going are rarely visible to the people walking through the front door. Royalty had built something real, but the same scale that made it impressive also made it expensive to sustain and complicated to manage. The thing about building an empire on horsepower and hype is that it works right up until the moment it doesn't. And for Royalty, the first signs of a problem weren't coming from the cars, they were coming from the people renting them. The customer complaints. Royalty had thousands of fans and a strong public reputation. But look past the highlight reel and into the actual complaint records, and a different pattern starts to emerge. One that says a lot about how this company handled the gap between what it promised and what customers actually experienced. Some of the complaints were about money. Customers flagged unexpected insurance add-ons, deposits that felt outsized, and cleaning charges that showed up in the final bill without a clear heads-up. Royalty's contracts had substantial fine print, and not every renter walked away feeling the deal had been straightforward. In an industry built on aspirational experiences, that kind of friction is particularly damaging, because the expectation was never just transportation. It was a dream, and when the dream costs more than advertised, people don't stay quiet. But the complaint that really defined Royalty's relationship with unhappy customers wasn't about a charge. In 2017, a customer named Nick Doomey filed a complaint with the Better Business Bureau that described something far more serious. According to Doomey, after he left a negative review of Royalty, the company responded by posting his personal information online, including his driver's license and credit card details. That's not a billing dispute. That's an accusation of targeted retaliation against a customer for speaking negatively about a business. Royalty's response was to go on the offensive. The company stated it had blurred out the sensitive details before posting and claimed it had filed charges against Doomey for credit card fraud, chargeback fraud, and defamation. A customer left a bad review and found himself facing legal action. That case got around in Las Vegas circles, and not in a way that helped the brand. It painted Royalty as a company that didn't just dismiss difficult customers, it came after them. Whether Doomey's original complaint had merit or not, the optics of that response were hard to recover from. It sent a clear signal about what a dissatisfied customer could expect if they went public. It's also worth noting that Royalty's stronger reviews are genuine. The nearly 2,000 TripAdvisor entries weren't padding. A real portion of customers walked away happy and said so. But a business that runs on volume will always produce unhappy customers. The question is how you handle them. Royalty's pattern was to escalate rather than absorb. That approach had built up over years, and it wasn't limited to one-off consumer disputes. Royalty had developed a public-facing identity, confident, direct, and not particularly interested in backing down. Houston's persona on YouTube, on social media, and in interviews reflected a founder who ran things on his own terms. That worked well when the business was growing and the attention was positive. It became a different kind of problem when the attention wasn't. Consumer complaints are manageable in most industries. They hurt, but they rarely shut a business down on their own. What changes the calculation is when disputes start attracting lawyers, and when the legal exposure stops being hypothetical and starts being documented in court filings. Royalty was almost there. What was building behind the scenes was no longer just a string of unhappy customers. It was a legal record, and that record was about to get a lot more specific. The lawsuits that changed the math. Customer complaints are one kind of problem. Active litigation is another. And by the time Royalty Exotic Cars found itself in court, the action wasn't coming from just one direction. The most substantial case on record came out of Texas. In 2020, a Dallas-based exotic car dealer called Boss Exotics filed a lawsuit against Royalty over the purchase of a used 2018 McLaren 720S. Boss Exotics had bought the car from Royalty for $135,000. The bill of sale represented that the vehicle had no mechanical issues and that the manufacturer's warranty remained in effect. After the McLaren was delivered, the dealer discovered over $44,000 worth of repairs that needed to be done. They also found out the factory warranty had been voided because the car had been used commercially as a rental vehicle, something Royalty allegedly failed to disclose. Boss Exotics filed claims for breach of contract, fraud, and deceptive trade practices. The case didn't resolve quickly. In October of 2023, 3 years after it was filed, a judge denied Royalty's motion for summary judgment. That's a meaningful development. It means the court reviewed the evidence and decided the case had enough substance to proceed toward trial. You don't get to bypass that by arguing the claims have no foundation. Then, in late 2024, a different legal challenge arrived from a completely different source. A former business associate filed suit in Colorado, claiming Royalty had breached a contract tied to a vehicle modification deal. This wasn't a customer complaint. It was someone who had worked with Royalty saying they'd been left holding the consequences of a deal that didn't go as agreed. 2 lawsuits, 2 different states, both of them getting to the core of how Royalty conducted business, with customers, with partners, and with the full disclosure of what was actually being sold. The Boss Exotics case is particularly worth examining. Royalty ran its fleet hard. Cars turned over constantly, driven by strangers at varying levels of care. Manufacturer warranties don't survive commercial rental use at that scale, not necessarily through bad intent, but because that's how warranties work. The issue in the lawsuit wasn't that the warranty had been voided. It was that the buyer allegedly wasn't told. $135,000 changes hands. The warranty is represented as intact, and the buyer later discovers both that it isn't and that there are $44,000 in repairs to address. In any business context, that's the basis of a fraud claim. It also reveals something broader about how Royalty offloaded retired fleet vehicles. Selling used supercars that had been through heavy rental use was part of how the business recouped costs. If those transactions were carrying legal exposure, that exposure wasn't going away on its own. The financial weight of active litigation isn't always visible from the outside, but it's substantial. Attorney fees, court filings, depositions, and the management attention pulled away from actually running the business all have real costs. For a company already absorbing fleet maintenance bills, insurance premiums, and operational overhead across 5 locations, the legal costs added another drain that didn't stop at one case. And underneath all of it, an entirely separate problem was building, one that had nothing to do with contracts or reviews. Las Vegas itself was starting to ask harder questions. The safety crisis that hit the whole industry. Even if Royalty had won every lawsuit and managed every customer dispute without incident, there was still a problem building in the background, one that threatened the entire Las Vegas exotic car rental industry, not just Royalty. Las Vegas had been dealing with a recognizable pattern for years. High-performance vehicles, tourist drivers with varying skill levels, and a city that doesn't exactly discourage excess. It's a combination that produces crashes. And by the early 2020s, those crashes had become serious enough to generate hard data and political attention. The most prominent incident to affect the industry came in September of 2021. An off-duty Connecticut police officer on vacation in Las Vegas crashed a rented Rolls-Royce Cullinan while driving under the influence, killing his passenger. The car wasn't from royalty. It came from a competitor. But when the crash made national headlines, the scrutiny fell on everyone in the exotic rental space equally. What followed was a formal examination of the problem. An official report found that 8 to 12% of the county's fatal crashes involved a luxury rental vehicle. Of those, 95% had an impaired driver behind the wheel. Those numbers gave local officials clear justification for intervention. Ideas under discussion included mandatory breathalyzers installed in rental supercars and real-time speed monitoring in vehicles. The conversation was no longer theoretical. It was moving toward policy. Royalty's own general manager went on record supporting stricter regulations, specifically arguing that anyone being handed the keys to a car producing 700-plus horsepower should be properly vetted first. It was a reasonable position that simultaneously acknowledged an uncomfortable reality about what the industry had become. Royalty wasn't untouched by crashes of its own. The company occasionally posted photos of damaged vehicles on social media. One notable post showed a severely damaged McLaren 720S with the caption, "Man down, it happened again." The transparency was noted, but what those posts also communicated was that serious incidents were a routine part of operations, not rare exceptions. The financial reality behind those incidents rarely gets discussed. Insurance for an exotic rental fleet is already a significant expense under normal circumstances. When an accident occurs in a way that voids coverage, impaired driving being the primary example, the company absorbs the full cost of a car worth hundreds of thousands of dollars with no recourse. That's not an edge case in this business. It's a recurring risk built into the model. Houston himself acknowledged what 10 years of this had taken from him personally. He said running the company had made him feel like he'd aged 10 years, more than 10 years. The weight of watching serious crashes happen, managing the aftermath, and carrying the knowledge that the next one was always a possibility. That's a cost that doesn't appear on a balance sheet. By early 2025, regulatory change wasn't just likely, it was arriving. The political will was there, the data was documented, and the industry had been given enough warning to know that new requirements were coming. For royalty, that would have meant added compliance costs and greater legal exposure in an environment that was already stretched. The commercial landscape was shifting too. Peer-to-peer rental platforms were growing, offering access to exotic cars with far less overhead and undercutting traditional rental pricing. Royalty's model, 5 buildings, a full staff, a substantial fleet, wasn't structured to compete on price with platforms running minimal operational costs. Everything was converging at once. And still, the most specific part of the story hadn't been said out loud. The untold truth behind the shutdown. This is where the public story ends and the actual story begins. When Houston Cross posted his farewell video in May of 2025, most coverage focused on the emotional goodbye. 11 years, thank you to the fans, the promise of to be continued. But there was a part of what he said that got far less attention. He mentioned a lawsuit. He mentioned an insurance problem. Then he brought up a body shop situation and said he'd been told he couldn't discuss it publicly. That's worth sitting with. They told me I can't talk about it means there's an active legal instruction in place. It means the body shop incident, the insurance problem, and the lawsuit are connected. And that connection is sensitive enough that Houston had been advised to stay quiet about the details. That's not a vague business reason for shutting down. That's a specific, unresolved legal situation that was still live at the time of the closure. What we can piece together is this. Insurance had been a pressure point for royalty for years. Running an exotic rental fleet in a high-liability environment, Managing crash costs that coverage sometimes didn't absorb was always going to carry significant insurance exposure. When a body shop enters that equation, whether through a disputed repair, a mishandled claim, or damage that affected a vehicle's rental or resale value, the insurance implications can quickly become severe. The legal instruction Houston referenced suggests the matter was either in active litigation or subject to a confidential settlement agreement. Either way, it means the shutdown wasn't purely a business decision driven by burnout or competition. There was a specific active situation that was influencing the timeline, one Houston was not free to explain. He was also direct about the operational cost structure. 5 buildings, a full staff, power bills and labor costs running across all of it. He said he had already started cutting those expenses before the announcement, and that looking back, the closure should have come earlier. That framing matters. It doesn't describe a sudden collapse. It describes someone who had been watching the pressure accumulate for a while and had finally made the call. The body shop situation may have been what moved the timeline forward. The shutdown went public through Royalty's social media in May of 2025. Royalty Exotic Car Rentals is closed. We couldn't have done it without you. Thank you for being part of the journey. To be continued. That last phrase turned out to be accurate. By mid-2025, Royalty's website had rebranded, presenting the company as Las Vegas's premier hypercar dealer, focused on selling exotic vehicles rather than renting them. The shift is meaningful. Car dealing carries a fundamentally different risk profile than car rental. There's no daily liability from strangers driving your inventory. The margins are higher. The overhead is lower. The legal exposure is a fraction of what rental operations generate. For someone who had spent 11 years absorbing the full cost of the rental model, pivoting to dealing was a logical move. And Houston said as much, framing it as a decision towards something more scalable long-term. By June of 2025, both the Better Business Bureau and Google had listed Royalty Exotic Cars as permanently closed. The rental chapter was finished. What makes Royalty's story worth examining closely is not that the business eventually closed, it's that it survived as long as it did, while so many things were working against it. The model was risky from day one. Cars burned and broke in the first year. Customer disputes accumulated. Lawsuits arrived from multiple directions. Crashes kept happening. Regulations were closing in. The competitive landscape was shifting underneath the business. And somewhere inside all of that, there was a body shop situation and an insurance problem that Houston still isn't allowed to talk about. 11 years. And his own assessment, at the end of it, was that the door should have closed earlier than it did. That's not a story about failure. That's a story about how long someone kept going and everything they were carrying while they did. What do you think about the truth behind the Royalty Exotic Car Rentals' sudden shutdown? Share with us in the comments. Let's keep the conversation going. If this story was moving for you, smash that like button, subscribe for more untold Hollywood tales, and hit the bell so you never miss a drop. Want more? Check out another one of our videos. Thanks for watching.